You don't even know how to drive a boat, do you?
Just tie ropes and Polish yachts all day. That's about all someone with your terrible English can handle, right?
Richard Sterling's voice carried across the Miami beach. Marina, as he gestured dismissively at the Brazilian dockworker who was cleaning his 60-foot yacht.
Making sure his group of wealthy friends heard every word of his mockery.
I mean, seriously, did you even study to do this job? Or is this just what happens when you come to America without education or proper language skills?
What Richard didn't know, what this arrogant South Florida real estate millionaire was too, busy showing off for his executive friends to notice, was that the dumb dock worker with terrible English he'd been humiliating for months was actually Paulo Silva, one of Brazil's most renowned marine engineers and petroleum geologists who designed offshore oil platform foundations worth billions of dollars.
Now reduced to polishing boats and tying ropes because the United States wouldn't recognize his credentials, and his asylum application had left him unable to practice engineering,
While fleeing corporate corruption in Brazil that had threatened to murder his family. And what Richard definitely didn't realize was that in approximately 20 minutes, his yacht's fuel system would develop a catastrophic failure, creating explosion risk that could kill 50 plus people throughout the marina. The Venetian Causeway drawbridge would be stuck in the raised position, preventing fire department access. And the only thing standing between Richard and a maritime disaster would be the stupid ropeteer,
whose marine engineering expertise far exceeded any American yacht designer Richard could hire, bro.
You see, I was actually at that Miami Beach marina for a security consultation. The marina.
Management had hired my firm to assess their security systems and access control protocols, something I'd been doing for waterfront properties throughout my career.
I'd been there for 3 days already, observing operations and interviewing staff, which meant I'd witnessed Richard Sterling's pattern of treating Paulo Silva with contempt that went beyond normal employer-worker dynamics into
Something uglier and more personal.
And I noticed Paulo too, because after 40 years watching how people carry themselves, you develop instinct for recognizing when someone's current job doesn't match their actual capabilities.
The way Paulo assessed boat systems reminded me of engineers I'd worked with. That systematic evaluation, looking at problems from multiple angles, understanding how complex systems interconnected in ways that went far beyond just cleaning and maintenance.
Before I tell you how Richard's fuel system crisis revealed that the dumb Brazilian he'd been tormenting was actually more qualified to handle maritime engineering emergencies than anyone else at the marina, let me ask you something that probably hits home for folks who've witnessed class-based discrimination. Have you seen immigrants with professional backgrounds being mocked for doing manual labor, with wealthy people assuming their current job reflects their intelligence rather than their circumstances? Drop your city and country in the comments and share stories about qualified professionals you've met doing survival work while facing contempt from entitled people who have no idea about their expertise. Because what happened at that Miami marina is going to show you exactly why assumptions about people based on their current uniform and accent can literally determine whether you survive or die in an explosion. And hey, before we get deep into Paulo's story, let me give appreciation to Fernando Santos from Miami, Florida, and Lisa Chen from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who've been consistently engaging with our videos.
Fernando?
Your comment about your father, who was an architect in Colombia, but works construction here, really connected with viewers.
Lisa, appreciate you sharing how your uncle, who was a chemical engineer in China, working in a dry cleaning business.
Y'all keep sharing because these stories remind people that immigrants' current jobs often have zero connection to their actual qualifications and expertise.
Now, if you'll pardon an old man for getting comfortable here in this marina office where I'm reviewing security footage while finishing up my consultation report, stories about refugee professionals forced into manual labor while escaping corruption or violence always affect me deeply.
At my age, having worked security in corporate environments, conflict zones, and everywhere humans face threats, I've met countless engineers, scientists, and technical professionals who fled their countries not because they wanted better opportunities, but because staying meant becoming complicit with corruption or watching their families get threatened. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most dramatic demonstrations I ever witnessed of why judging refugee immigrants by their current circumstances ignores the expertise and courage they bring despite impossible obstacles. To understand how Paulo Silva ended up polishing yachts at the Miami Marina despite being one of Brazil's most accomplished marine engineers and petroleum geologists, we gotta go back about 5 years to end his career at Petrobras, Brazil's massive state-owned oil company. intersected with the corruption scandals that were destroying careers and endangering anyone who refused to participate in illegal schemes. Paulo had been born in Santos, Brazil in 1975, growing up in a port city where massive ships and offshore oil platforms were constant presence in daily life. His father had been a merchant marine captain, his mother a mathematics teacher, and Paulo had been fascinated by maritime engineering from childhood, the kind of kid who'd sketch ship designs and study how offshore structures withstood ocean forces. I grew up watching oil platforms being built in Santos shipyards, Paulo had told me during our conversation after the Marina crisis. These massive steel structures designed to extract petroleum from ocean floor kilometers below the surface, withstanding hurricanes and waves and corrosive salt water for decades. The engineering that goes into offshore platforms is incredible. Marine engineering, petroleum geology, material science all working together. That's what I wanted to do, design the foundations that made offshore oil extraction possible. Paulo's engineering education had been completed at University de São Paulo, one of Brazil's premier technical universities where he'd earned degrees in both naval architecture and petroleum geology. The combination was relatively rare. Most marine engineers focused on ship design or offshore structures, while petroleum geologists typically worked on exploration and reservoir analysis. Paulo's expertise in both disciplines made him particularly valuable for designing offshore oil platform foundations, where understanding both the structural engineering and the geological characteristics of the seabed was essential. By 2010, at age 35, Paulo had been working for Petrobras for over a decade and had become one of their leading experts in offshore platform foundation design. He'd worked on dozens of projects in Brazil's pre-salt offshore oil fields, some of the world's most challenging deep-water drilling environments, where platforms needed to extract oil from reservoirs kilometers below the ocean floor while withstanding the extreme forces of deep ocean conditions. I designed foundation systems for platforms worth billions of dollars, Paulo had explained. These weren't simple structures. They were complex engineering systems that had to account for ocean currents, wave forces, seabed geology, hurricane loads, corrosion, decades of operation. One mistake in foundation design could mean a platform collapsing and killing everyone on it, or an environmental disaster from uncontrolled oil releases. The engineering had to be perfect. Paulo's expertise had been internationally recognized. He published papers in marine engineering journals, presented at petroleum engineering conferences, consulted on offshore projects in other countries. His designs had been so successful that several of his foundation systems had become templates that other engineers used for similar projects. By Brazilian engineering standards, Paulo had achieved the kind of career success that typically meant comfortable financial security and professional respect. But Brazil's decisive Lava Jato corruption scandal, which eventually implicated hundreds of politicians and business leaders in schemes involving Petrobras contracts, had made Paulo's expertise dangerous rather than valuable. By 2018, Paulo had been pressured to falsify engineering reports to justify awarding contracts to companies that were paying bribes to Petrobras executives, essentially compromising the safety of offshore platforms to facilitate corruption. The pressure started subtly, Paulo had recalled, his voice carrying the trauma of those experiences. Senior managers would ask me to approve foundation designs that didn't meet safety standards, claiming we needed to work with specific contractors for business reasons. When I refused and documented the safety issues, I'd get threatened with termination, with being blacklisted from the industry, with having my engineering license revoked. But then the threats escalated beyond professional retaliation, Paulo had continued. I started receiving anonymous messages warning me to cooperate or face consequences. Someone broke into my car and left documents showing they knew where my children went to school, where my wife worked, where my parents lived. The implicit threat was clear. Approve the unsafe designs and participate in the corruption, or watch your family suffer. The breaking point had come in early 2019 when Paulo had been ordered to approve a foundation design for an offshore platform that he knew was dangerously inadequate for the geological conditions. His analysis had shown that the proposed foundation would likely fail within 10 years, potentially causing the platform to collapse with dozens of workers on board. But the contractor who'd submitted the design was part of the corruption scheme, and approving it was necessary for the bribes to flow. I refused to sign off on the design and filed a detailed engineering report.
documenting why it was unsafe.
Paulo had explained. 3 days later, armed men showed up at my house at 2 a.m., held guns to my head in front of my wife and children, and told me I had 1 week to approve the design or they'd return to solve the problem permanently. That's when my wife and I decided we couldn't stay in Brazil.
Paulo and his wife Mariana had left Brazil with their 2 children, son Lucas, age 12, daughter Sofia, age 9, entering the United States through Mexico and requesting asylum at the border. Their asylum claim had been based on the documented death threats from criminal organizations connected to Petrobras corruption. But processing that claim would take years, during which Paulo's professional status remained in limbo. We applied for asylum in March 2019, Paulo had told me. But the process takes 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer. During that time, my work authorization was limited and conditional. I couldn't practice engineering without proper licensing and immigration status. My Brazilian engineering credentials weren't recognized without going through expensive validation processes I couldn't afford.
So I was stuck highly qualified marine engineer with 20 years of experience, but unable to work in my actual profession. What Paulo discovered was that the United States engineering licensing system, supposedly designed to ensure competent practice but functioning primarily to protect American engineers from foreign competition, made it nearly impossible for internationally trained engineers to practice, particularly refugees without access to comprehensive documentation from their home countries.
I needed my university transcripts, my Petrobras employment records, documentation of every project I'd worked on, letters from colleagues, Paulo had explained, but requesting those records from Brazilian institutions would alert corrupt officials to where I'd degone and potentially endanger colleagues who helped me.
Plus, the credentialing agencies wanted me to essentially redo my entire engineering education, taking American courses,
Passing multiple exams,
completing supervised practice even though I had 20 years of design experience.
Paulo's asylum application was still pending after 5 years,
stuck in massive immigration court backlogs that had only gotten worse over time. His work authorization allowed basic employment, but not professional engineering practice without proper licensing. He tried applying for technical positions that didn't require professional engineer certification, drafting,
CAD work, project management.
but even those roles preferred candidates with American credentials and questioned
Why someone who claimed to be a senior engineer was willing to take entry-level technical positions. I was running out of money. My family was living in a small apartment in Miami with my brother, and I needed income immediately, Paulo had explained.
A friend who worked at Miami Beach Marina said they needed dock workers, people to maintain boats, handle lines, clean vessels. The pay was $16 an hour, which wasn't great but was stable. So Paulo Silva, marine engineer who designed billion-dollar offshore platforms, became Paulo the dock worker who polished yachts and tied ropes. The psychological toll had been devastating. Paulo would work his dock shifts at the marina, then return home and study engineering journals to maintain his technical knowledge. He practiced structural calculations using his children's homework paper, keeping his engineering skills sharp even though he couldn't legally use them. He watched boat owners struggle with basic maritime systems and want desperately to help, but worried that revealing his engineering background would raise questions about why a qualified engineer was working a manual labor job.
The hardest part wasn't the financial loss or status decrease, Paulo had told me. It was knowing I had expertise in offshore engineering and maritime safety,
that I had spent my career designing systems that protected people and prevented disasters. And I was cleaning boats while watching amateur boat owners create dangerous conditions because they didn't understand marine engineering. But I couldn't intervene without exposing that I was overqualified, which might prompt questions about my immigration status or why I wasn't licensed.
I'd been conducting my security
assessment at Miami Beach Marina for 3 days when I first witnessed the dynamic between Richard Sterling and Paulo Silva. Richard was one of those wealthy boat owners who made marinas unpleasant for everyone. Loud, entitled, treating staff like servants who existed solely to maintain his vessel. He'd been docked at the marina for several weeks, and his behavior toward Paulo had apparently been consistently contemptuous during that entire period.
Richard's mockery of Paulo had multiple dimensions: linguistic prejudice about Paulo's Brazilian accent, class contempt for manual labor, and that particular brand of
wealthy American arrogance that assumes anyone working a service job must be uneducated or incapable of anything more demanding. The combination had created a pattern where Richard seemed to take genuine pleasure in publicly humiliating Paulo, particularly when Richard had an audience of other wealthy boat owners or his executive friends.
"You don't even know how to drive a boat, do you?"
Richard had said to Paulo on the morning I'd witnessed their first major interaction. Paulo had been cleaning Richard's yacht, a 60-foot azimuth named Sterling Success, when Richard had arrived with a group of friends for a day cruise.
Just tie ropes and Polish yachts all day? That's about all someone with your terrible English can handle, right? "I can operate boats, Mr. Sterling," Paulo had replied with professional dignity, his English functional but carrying that distinct Brazilian accent.
"But my job here is maintenance and dock services, not captain services."
"Yeah, I'm sure you can operate boats," Richard had laughed, looking at his friends to make sure they appreciated his mockery. "Probably like a canoe or something."
"This is a 60-foot luxury yacht with complex systems. Definitely beyond what someone at your level could understand."
"I understand marine systems," Paulo had said quietly, not elaborating on exactly how much he understood about marine engineering. "Is there something specific you need help with today?" "What I need," Richard had replied with exaggerated patience, like he was talking to a child,
"Is for you to finish cleaning and get out of the way so real professionals can check my systems before we go out. I'm paying good money to have this boat maintained, and having someone like you touching expensive equipment makes me nervous."
I'd felt my jaw tighten watching this interaction. After 40 years observing workplace dynamics,
Richard's behavior was textbook entitled cruelty.
the kind where wealthy people derive pleasure from reminding service workers of status differences.
Paulo had simply nodded and moved to finish his cleaning, maintaining professional composure despite the obvious humiliation. That guy treats Paulo like garbage constantly. One of the marina's other dock workers, a Cuban immigrant named Carlos, had told me quietly after Richard had left.
"It's not just normal boss employee stuff."
Richard specifically targets Paulo, makes fun of his English, acts like he's stupid because he works a manual job. None of us like Richard, but Paulo handles it better than I would. Never fights back, never gets angry, just does his job professionally.
"Does Paulo have some other background?" I'd asked, my instinct telling me there's more to Paulo's story than just a dock worker with good composure.
Carlos had looked around to make sure nobody was listening.
"Paulo's an engineer? Like a serious engineer designed offshore oil platforms in Brazil or something?"
But he can't work as an engineer here because of immigration stuff. He works the dock to support his family while waiting for asylum to process.
Most people at the marina don't know. And Paulo doesn't advertise it because he doesn't want problems with his immigration case. That had confirmed what I'd suspected watching Paulo work. His systematic approach to boat maintenance, the way he assessed maritime systems, his careful attention to safety protocols that went beyond what dock workers typically demonstrated. Paulo wasn't just someone who tied ropes and cleaned boats. He was a highly trained professional doing survival work while navigating impossible immigration and licensing barriers.
Over my 3 days at the marina, I'd watched Richard's pattern of contempt toward Paulo continue and escalate. Every interaction involved some form of mockery about Paulo's English, his job, or his perceived lack of education.
Richard seemed to particularly enjoy humiliating Paulo in front of audiences, other boat owners,
marina staff, Richard's wealthy friends who visited his yacht. The cruelty was both calculated and casual, suggesting this was how Richard routinely treated people he viewed as beneath him. The situation that would expose Richard's ignorance and Paulo's expertise had developed on day 4 of my security assessment, a Saturday morning when the marina was busy with weekend boaters preparing for day cruises. Richard had arrived with a group of 6 friends, all wealthy business executives, based on their conversation about investments and corporate strategy, planning to take Sterling Success out for the day.
Richard's yacht was a beautiful vessel, an azimuth 60 flybridge worth approximately $2 million, equipped with twin Caterpillar diesel engines, sophisticated navigation systems, and luxury accommodations.
It was exactly the kind of expensive toy that wealthy Americans bought to demonstrate status, often without actually understanding the complex systems that kept such vessels operating safely. Paulo had been on duty that morning, responsible for helping boats prepare for departure, checking lines, assisting with dock procedures, generally ensuring safe operations during the busiest time of the week. When Richard had approached with his group, Paulo had been professional and courteous as always, preparing to assist with Sterling Success's departure. "Oh, great, it's you again," Richard had said when he'd seen Paulo near his yacht. "Try not to mess anything up today, okay? I've got important guests, and I don't need any problems caused by incompetent dock workers who can barely speak English." "Everything is prepared for your departure, Mr. Sterling," Paulo had replied, gesturing to the dock lines and systems he'd already checked. "Your vessel is ready whenever you want to leave." "Did you even study to do this job, or is this just what happens when you come to America without education or proper language skills?" Richard had continued, making sure his friends heard. His group had laughed uncomfortably. The kind of nervous laughter that happens when someone is being cruel, but nobody wants to challenge them. "Seriously though, what's your actual education? Did you finish high school in Brazil, or did you come here hoping to learn basic skills?" "I have education, Mr. Sterling," Paulo had replied quietly, not elaborating on his engineering degrees, because past experience had taught him that revealing professional credentials while working a manual labor job raised uncomfortable questions. "Is there anything specific you need before departure?" "What I need is for you to understand that this is a complex, expensive yacht that requires knowledge you don't have," Richard had said, condescendingly. "So, just tie it off when I tell you and try not to damage anything." That's about the level of responsibility someone at your skill level can handle. Richard and his guests had boarded Sterling Success, and Richard had begun the departure procedures, starting engines, checking systems, preparing to cast off from the dock. Paulo had been standing by to assist with lines as requested, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the ongoing mockery. That's when the fuel system problem had begun developing. Sterling Success's fuel system, like most large yachts, was complex, involving multiple fuel tanks, transfer pumps, filtration systems, and distribution networks that supplied diesel to the twin engines. The system had apparently developed a leak in one of the fuel transfer lines, allowing diesel fuel to drip into the engine compartment where it could encounter hot engine components. Paulo had noticed first the distinctive smell of diesel fuel that indicated leaking rather than just normal engine exhaust. His engineering training had immediately flagged this as dangerous, but he hesitated to say anything because warning Richard about fuel system problems would raise questions about how a dock worker knew enough about marine engineering to diagnose such issues. "Mr. Sterling," Paulo had called out as Richard was preparing to leave the dock, "I'm smelling diesel fuel very strongly from your vessel. You should check engine compartment before departure." "I'm sure you smell something," Richard had replied dismissively from the helm. "But I just had this boat service last week. Everything's fine." "You probably don't even know what normal diesel smell is versus a problem, so don't worry about it." "No, sir, this is not normal smell," Paulo had insisted, his concern overriding his usual caution about revealing knowledge. "This smells like active fuel leak, not exhaust. You should not start engines until you inspect system." "Look, I appreciate your concern," Richard had said with exaggerated patience, "but I've owned boats for 20 years. I think I know a little more about marine systems than someone who ties ropes for a living. We're fine. Just cast off the lines so we can get going." Paulo had reluctantly released the dock lines as requested, watching Sterling Success begin pulling away from the dock with visible concern on his face. I'd been about 50 yards away reviewing security camera placements, but I'd noticed Paulo's body language and moved closer to see what was concerning him. "Something wrong?" I'd asked Paulo. "Mr. Sterling's yacht has fuel leak," Paulo had said, his eyes never leaving the vessel as it moved through the marina. "I smell it clearly. Diesel leaking into engine compartment. With hot engines, that's serious fire and explosion risk." But he won't listen to me because he thinks I don't know anything about boats. How do you know it's a fuel leak versus normal diesel smell? I'd asked. Because I'm a marine engineer, Paulo had replied, his focus still on sterling success. 20 years designing offshore platforms and understanding marine fuel systems. I know exactly what diesel leak smells like versus exhaust, and that yacht has active fuel leak. That's getting worse. As if to confirm Paulo's diagnosis, Sterling Success-esh engines had suddenly changed pitch, the distinctive sound of engines running irregularly, as fuel pressure fluctuated due to the leak. Richard had clearly noticed because the yacht had slowed significantly, and we'd been able to see him gesturing to his friends with obvious concern. Then smoke had started appearing from Sterling Success' engine compartment, visible even from our position on the dock. Not flames yet, but the gray-white smoke that indicated diesel fuel was vaporizing on hot engine surfaces, creating exactly the explosion risk that Paulo had warned about. He needs to shut down engines immediately, Paulo had said urgently. Continuing to run engines with diesel leak is going to cause explosion. Those are Caterpillar C-32 engines. They run at temperatures high enough to ignite diesel vapors. If fuel leak is significant, entire engine compartment could explode. Richard had apparently reached the same conclusion because Sterling Success's engines had suddenly shut down, leaving the yacht drifting in the marina about 200 yards from the dock. But stopping the engines didn't eliminate the danger. Diesel fuel was still leaking, and the engine components were still hot enough to cause ignition. We'd been able to see Richard and his guests on deck, clearly panicked about the smoke coming from below. The marina's emergency systems had activated. Alarm sounding, staff responding to the situation, someone calling 911 to request fire department assistance. But then we de-encountered the complication that would make Paulo's expertise essential rather than just helpful. The Venetian Causeway Drawbridge, which connected Miami Beach to mainland Miami, had raised to allow a large sailboat to pass through. Bridges up, Carlos had noted with alarm, watching the raised drawbridge about half a mile away. Fire trucks can't get here from Miami until it goes back down. That's usually 15 to 20 minutes depending on boat traffic. 20 minutes was too long if Sterling Success's fuel leak caused an explosion. The yacht was drifting in the marina near dozens of other boats, any of which could be damaged or destroyed if Sterling Success exploded. More critically, there were approximately 50 people in the immediate area, on boats, on docks, at the marina restaurant, all of whom would be at risk if a major explosion occurred. We need to get Sterling Success away from other boats, the marina manager had said, recognizing the danger. If it explodes near the dock, it could start a chain reaction with other vessels' fuel tanks. But Richard can't move it without engines, and we can't get fire department help for 15 plus minutes. I can help, Paulo had said quietly. I'm a marine engineer. I can assess the fuel system, determine exact problem, and potentially fix it, or at least control the leak until fire department arrives. But I need to get to the vessel. You're a marine engineer? The marina manager had looked surprised. I thought you were just dock maintenance. I am for work purposes, Paulo had confirmed. But I'm trained marine engineer and petroleum geologist. 20 years experience. Designed offshore oil platforms in Brazil. I understand marine fuel systems better than most yacht mechanics. If you get me to that boat, I can probably prevent explosion. The marina manager had made the decision quickly. Paulo's claimed expertise was our best option given that fire department was blocked. And Sterling Success was drifting toward other vessels with an active fuel leak. Within 2 minutes, Paulo and I had been in one of the marina's service boats heading toward Sterling Success. Paulo explaining his assessment as we approached. Based on smoke pattern and engine sounds, I think fuel transfer line failed, Paulo had explained. These Azimuth 60s have known issue with fuel line connections near the engine mounts. Vibration can loosen fittings over time, especially if they weren't properly maintained. Leak allows diesel to drip onto hot engine block, creating vapor that looks like smoke. If enough fuel accumulates and ignition occurs, explosion risk is severe. What can you do? I asked. First, assess exact leak location and severity, Paulo had said.
Then either repair the line if possible, or at minimum control the leak and cool the engine components to prevent ignition.
I've dealt with similar situations on offshore platforms. Petroleum leaks near hot equipment. Explosion prevention, emergency systems. This is smaller scale, but same principles. We'd reached sterling success within 5 minutes, pulling alongside while Richard and his guests had been huddled on deck,
visibly frightened by the smoke still emanating from below. Richard's earlier arrogance had been replaced by panic and confusion about what was happening
to his expensive yacht, Paulo.
Richard had said with surprise when he'd seen the dock worker climbing aboard.
"What are you doing here?" "We called the fire department."
"Fire department is blocked by raised drawbridge,"
Paulo had explained, already moving toward the engine compartment hatch.
"Marina manager sent me because I'm actually a marine engineer with 20 years experience. I'm going to assess your fuel leak and try to prevent explosion while we wait for fire department to arrive." "You're a marine engineer?" Richard's voice had carried disbelief mixed with desperate hope.
"But you work the dock? You clean boats?"
"I work dock because I can't get engineering license while waiting for asylum approval," Paulo had replied, opening the engine compartment hatch and immediately assessing the situation below with practiced efficiency. "But I designed offshore oil platforms in Brazil, including all fuel systems.
I know exactly what I'm looking at." "And you have serious problem?"
What Paulo had seen in the engine compartment had confirmed his diagnosis. A fuel transfer line had failed at a connection point near the starboard engine mount, and diesel fuel was actively dripping onto the hot engine block.
The engine was still warm enough that fuel was vaporizing on contact, creating the smoke we'd seen.
If enough fuel accumulated in the right concentration, any spark or sufficient heat could cause an explosion that would destroy the yacht and potentially kill everyone on board or nearby. "This is exactly what I thought," Paulo had said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable urgency. "Fuel line connection failed due to vibration and inadequate maintenance."
"You have active diesel leak onto hot engine, creating vapor that's highly flammable."
"We're probably 10 to 15 minutes from conditions where explosion becomes likely." "Can you fix it?"
Richard had asked, all his earlier contempt replaced by desperate dependence on the stupid dock worker,
who suddenly become the only person qualified to save his yacht, and possibly his life. "I can stop the leak and cool the engine," Paulo had confirmed. "But I need tools and fire suppression equipment from Marina. And everyone needs to evacuate the vessel except me. If explosion occurs, I don't want casualties." Richard and his 6 guests had been transferred to the service boat, leaving just Paulo and me on sterling success.
The Marina had delivered tools and fire suppression equipment,
and Paulo had spent the next 25 minutes performing what was essentially emergency petroleum engineering in a yacht's engine compartment. I need to isolate this fuel line, stop the leak, and cool the engine below ignition temperature, Paulo had explained while working with practiced efficiency. Then I'll ventilate the compartment to remove accumulated diesel vapors. Similar to emergency procedures on offshore platforms when we have petroleum leaks near hot equipment, same safety principles apply. Asterisk, what I'd watched.
Paulo do over those 25 minutes was a masterclass in marine engineering and petroleum.
Safety performed by someone who clearly handled similar emergencies under worse conditions than a yacht engine compartment. He had isolated the failed fuel line by closing specific valves in the system, stopping the active leak, used fire suppression foam to cool the hot engine components below diesel ignition temperature, ventilated the engine compartment to remove accumulated flammable vapors, assessed the entire fuel system for other potential failure points, temporarily repaired the failed connection using materials from the marina. So the yacht could be safely moved, continuously monitored for any signs of ignition or renewed leaking. His hands had moved with confident precision. His decisions had been instantaneous and correct, and his running explanation had demonstrated depth of understanding that only someone with extensive petroleum engineering experience would possess. This connection failed because it wasn't properly torqued during last service, Paulo had explained while working. Vibration from engine operation loosened the fitting over time until fuel started leaking. On offshore platforms, we use different connection standards specifically to prevent this issue.
But yacht industry often uses cheaper fittings that can fail if not maintained properly.
Are you going to be able to prevent explosion? I'd asked. Already prevented, Paulo had replied with quiet confidence. Leak is stopped. Engine is cool. Vapors are ventilated. Explosion risk is now minimal. When fire department arrives, they can verify my assessment, but the immediate danger is controlled. The fire department had arrived about 30 minutes into Paulo's work, after the drawbridge had finally been lowered, and their assessment had confirmed what Paulo had already accomplished. The fire chief, a veteran with 20-plus years experience, had been impressed by Paulo's emergency response. Whoever handled this fuel leak did exceptional work, the fire chief had said after inspecting the engine compartment. Perfect isolation of the failed line, proper cooling procedures, effective ventilation to remove flammable vapors.
This is commercial petroleum facility level safety response, not typical yacht emergency procedure. Who performed this work?
I did, Paulo had replied.
I'm marine engineer and petroleum geologist from Brazil. 20 years experience including offshore oil platform design. I've handled petroleum leaks and explosion prevention many times in industrial settings.
Then you know this could have been catastrophic, the fire chief had said. If this leak had continued with hot engines, we'd be looking at an explosion that could have destroyed multiple boats and caused mass casualties. Your response prevented a major maritime disaster. The fire chief's assessment had been backed by the marina manager's quick calculation of what could have been lost. Sterling success worth $2 million, plus at least 5 other nearby boats worth a combined $8 million, plus potential casualties among the 50-plus people in the immediate area.
Paulo's engineering expertise had prevented financial losses in excess of $10 million.
And potential loss of life that would have been far more devastating than any monetary calculation. Richard had been standing on the dock when Paulo and the fire chief had emerged from sterling success, and his expression had been difficult to read, some combination of profound gratitude, deep shame, and the cognitive dissonance of reconciling months of contempt for a stupid dock worker with the reality that Paulo was a highly qualified engineer who just saved Richard's yacht and possibly Richard's life. Paulo, Richard had begun, his voice unsteady. I don't even know where to start apologizing.
For months, I've treated you like you were stupid because you work a manual labor job and have an accent.
I've mocked your English, questioned your education, acted like you were incapable of understanding anything beyond basic rope work. And then my yacht nearly explodes, and you, the dumb dock worker I've been humiliating, turn out to be one of the most qualified marine engineers anyone here has ever met. Richard had continued, starting to cry.
You saved my yacht, probably saved my life and my friends' lives, potentially saved dozens of other people from explosion.
And you did it despite having every reason to let me deal with the consequences of my own ignorance and cruelty.
I don't hold grudge, Mr. Sterling, Paulo had replied with the dignity he'd maintained throughout months of abuse.
I'm an engineer.
When I see petroleum safety problem, I fix it regardless of who owns the vessel or how they've treated me.
That's professional obligation, not personal favor. But I need you to understand something, Paulo had continued, his voice firm but not angry.
What you said to me for months, that I'm stupid because I work dock.
That I can't understand complex systems because I have accent. That my English means I'm uneducated. That happens constantly to immigrants working survival jobs.
You see someone in work uniform doing manual labor and make automatic assumptions about their intelligence and education. But that dock worker might be engineer like me, Paulo had explained. That janitor might be doctor. That food service worker might be scientist.
We redoing these jobs not because we lack education, but because American licensing systems do and recognize our credentials, or because immigration status prevents us from practicing our actual professions, or because supporting families while waiting years for asylum approval means taking whatever work is available. You only recognize my value after your yacht nearly exploded and you needed my engineering expertise. Paulo had concluded, but my value didn't change between when you were mocking me this morning and when you needed me this afternoon. I was the same engineer with the same knowledge. What changed was whether you could see past my job and my accent to recognize that expertise existed. The incident had generated local news coverage because yacht explosions in Miami Beach Marina would have been dramatic enough to warrant reporting. And the story of the dock worker engineer who'd prevented disaster had obvious human interest appeal. A local television crew had interviewed the marina manager and fire chief the next day, and their comments had created broader conversation about immigrant professionals. The gentleman who prevented this potential maritime disaster is a marine engineer and petroleum geologist from Brazil, with 20 years of experience designing offshore oil platforms. The marina manager had explained during the televised interview. His emergency response was exceptional, honestly better than most yacht mechanics I've worked with. He diagnosed the problem immediately, implemented perfect safety procedures, and prevented what could have been an explosion killing dozens of people. But here's what's troubling about this situation, the marina manager had continued, frustration evident in his voice. This engineer works as a dock worker at our marina because he can't get licensed to practice engineering while waiting for asylum approval. So we have someone with expertise in petroleum systems and marine safety, polishing boats and tying ropes, while yacht owners like Mr. Sterling assume he's uneducated because of his job and his accent. That yacht owner is alive today, with his expensive boat intact. Specifically because an immigrant with imperfect English had engineering expertise that nobody else at the marina possessed, the manager had concluded, that yacht owner is alive today, with his expensive boat intact. Specifically because an immigrant with imperfect English had engineering expertise that nobody else at the marina possessed. The manager had concluded, we need to ask ourselves whether our professional licensing and immigration systems are actually serving public safety or just creating barriers that waste life-saving expertise and put everyone at greater risk. The interview had gone viral in South Florida and within engineering communities nationally, generating discussions about immigrant professionals, credential recognition barriers, and the particular waste of forcing highly qualified engineers to work manual labor jobs. Several engineering firms had reached out expressing interest in hiring Paulo if his immigration status could be resolved. Immigration attorneys had offered pro bono assistance navigating his asylum case. And perhaps most significantly, the attention had prompted Florida's engineering licensing board to examine whether their credentialing processes created unnecessary obstacles for internationally trained engineers with demonstrated competence. Richard had requested to meet with Paulo several days after the incident, this time at a coffee shop rather than at the marina where their previous interactions had been defined by employer-worker power dynamics. Their conversation had been private, but Richard had later shared some of what was discussed during a remarkable public apology he posted on social media. I need to publicly acknowledge something that shamans me deeply, Richard's post had begun. For months, I treated a dock worker at Marina with contempt based purely on prejudice about his job and his accent. I made fun of his English, questioned his intelligence, acted superior because I own an expensive yacht and he ties ropes for a living. Last Saturday, my yacht developed a catastrophic fuel leak that could have caused an explosion killing me, my 6 friends, and potentially dozens of other people at the marina. Richard's post had continued. Fire department was blocked by a raised drawbridge, and the only person who could prevent disaster was Paulo Silva, the stupid dock worker I'd been mocking. Paulo is a marine engineer and petroleum geologist. Richard had explained he designed offshore oil platforms worth billions in Brazil. He has 20 years of experience with exactly the kind of petroleum safety emergencies that my yacht created. He works as a dock worker, not because he lacks education. He has more technical expertise than anyone I know, but because America's immigration and licensing systems prevent him from practicing engineering while his asylum application is processed. Paulo saved my yacht worth $2 million, saved my life and 6 others.
prevented an explosion that could have destroyed the entire marina, Richard's post had concluded. He did this despite months of me treating him like garbage, because his professional integrity matters more than personal vindication. I've learned a profound lesson about assumptions about immigrant professionals and about how job titles tell you nothing about someone's actual capabilities or character. I am committed to advocating for immigration and licensing reforms that prevent talented engineers like Paulo from being wasted in survival jobs. And I'm working to help Paulo specifically get the recognition and opportunities his expertise deserves. The post had been shared thousands of times, generating comments from people sharing similar stories about encountering highly qualified immigrants in unexpected jobs, about their own experiences with credential barriers, or about times when they'd underestimated someone based on superficial characteristics only to discover profound expertise. The story had resonated because it captured something universal about human assumptions and often invisible expertise that exists in people society dismisses. Asterisk, asterisk. Over the following months, Richard had proven genuinely committed to making amends and creating positive change from his earlier behavior. He'd hired an immigration attorney to handle Paulo's asylum case, pro bono connected. Paulo with engineering firms willing to sponsor his professional licensing. Funded the expensive credentialing process for validating. Paulo, as Brazilian engineering degrees, advocated publicly for immigration reform. That would streamline professional licensing for qualified refugees, created a fund to help other immigrant professionals at the marina afford licensing and credentialing. Costs given Paulo a substantial financial gift as both apology and recognition of the lives he'd saved. I can't undo months of cruelty. Richard had told me during a conversation 6 months after the incident, but I can use my resources and privilege to try to prevented immigrants from facing the barriers Paulo encountered, and I can make sure Paulo specifically gets the professional recognition he deserves instead of wasting his expertise cleaning boats. Paulo's asylum case had been expedited with Richard's legal, and within 8 months of the marina incident, Paulo had received formal refugee status, granting him permanent work authorization. His Brazilian engineering credentials had been validated through an accelerated review process, and after passing the required professional engineer exams, Paulo had received his Florida engineering license 5 years after fleeing Brazil, and 4 years after starting work as a dock worker. I cried when I got the engineering license, Paulo had told me during a phone call after the approval, not just because I could practice engineering again, but because it validated that everything I'd sacrificed, leaving my country, my career, my professional reputation, was worth it. For years, I questioned whether refusing to participate in corruption and fleeing Brazil was the right choice when it meant my family living in poverty and me working manual labor. Getting licensed felt like vindication that integrity matters even when the cost is devastating. Paulo had been hired by a Miami-based marine engineering firm specializing in offshore structures, bringing his 20-plus years of oil platform experience to projects throughout the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. His expertise in foundation design and petroleum systems had been immediately valuable. And within a year, he'd been promoted to senior engineer, leading major projects. Paulo is extraordinary, his engineering director had commented during a performance review. His experience base is incredible. Offshore platforms, petroleum systems, maritime safety, all at levels that most American engineers never achieve. His ability to diagnose problems quickly and implement solutions is exceptional. We're fortunate Florida reformed its licensing processes because Paulo is exactly the kind of engineer our industry desperately needs. That assessment had validated what Paulo had always known, that his Brazilian training and experience had made him a highly skilled marine engineer whose capabilities matched or exceeded American standards. The years he'd spent cleaning boats and tying ropes hadn't been because he lacked competence. They'd been because systematic barriers assumed foreign credentials were automatically inferior, and because immigration policies created impossible situations where qualified professionals couldn't practice while waiting years for asylum approval. Richard had continued his advocacy work and had developed what appeared to be genuine friendship with Paulo. Their relationship transformed from abusive employer-worker dynamic to colleagues working toward immigration reform. Richard had funded engineering scholarships for refugee students, supported immigrant professional organizations, and used his business platform to advocate for licensing policies that recognized international expertise.
I think about that Saturday constantly. Richard had told me during a conversation 2 years after the incident. Not just the terror of watching my yacht about to explode, though that was horrific.
But the realization that my own prejudice almost prevented my rescue. I'd spent months creating an environment where Paulo might have been justified in letting me face the consequences of my ignorance while waiting for fire department that might arrive. Too late, but he didn't, Richard had continued. Despite my cruelty, despite being under no obligation to risk himself helping me, despite the fact that revealing his engineering expertise might complicate his immigration case, Paulo saved my life and dozens of others because that's what engineers do. They prevent disasters regardless of whether the people they're helping deserve that help. That kind of professional integrity, maintaining engineering ethics even when it costs you personally, that's character at a level I'm still trying to develop. This experience fundamentally changed how I view immigrants and how I understand professional competence. Richard had reflected, I used to assume that people's jobs reflected their capabilities. If someone was doing manual labor, I thought that represented the limit of what they could do. Now I understand that for many immigrants, their current job has zero correlation with their actual expertise. Education or professional background. The person cleaning boats might be an engineer, Richard had concluded. The janitor might be a doctor. The food service worker might be a scientist. And making assumptions about their intelligence or capabilities based on their current circumstances rather than actually knowing who they are can literally cost lives, as I nearly learned in the most dramatic way possible. 3 years after the marina incident, Paulo had become a recognized expert in offshore platform foundation design, had published several papers in marine engineering journals, and had been invited to present at international petroleum engineering conferences. He'd also become a prominent advocate for engineering, licensing reform, using his story to push for recognition of international engineering credentials and streamlined pathways for refugee engineers. There are thousands of foreign-trained engineers in America working construction, driving delivery trucks, doing manual labor, any job that doesn't require professional engineer licensing, because our credentialing systems won't recognize their expertise. Paulo had explained during testimony before a Florida legislative committee, we're not asking for shortcuts or special treatment. We're asking that our education and experience be evaluated and then automatically rejected because we trained outside the United States. The argument that we need to redo education to ensure competence doesn't survive scrutiny, Paulo had continued. I proved my competence by preventing a maritime disaster using 20 years of petroleum engineering expertise. I passed the same professional engineer exams that American engineers take. I demonstrated my skills through supervised practice. That's legitimate quality assurance. But requiring me to essentially repeat my entire engineering education, despite 2 decades of professional experience, that's not quality protection. It's protectionism that wastes expertise and actively harms public safety by preventing qualified engineers from practicing, Paulo had concluded. Richard Sterling's yacht nearly exploded while I was polishing boats instead of practicing engineering. How many other disasters are waiting to happen because we decided immigrant engineers' credentials don't count? The testimony had been part of broader advocacy efforts that were generating momentum for engineering licensing reform. Several states beyond Florida had begun exploring streamlined pathways for internationally trained engineers. Professional engineering organizations were examining more flexible approaches to credential validation, and engineering firms facing talent shortages were pushing for immigration policies that would make it easier to hire qualified foreign engineers. Now, before I wrap up Paulo's story and finish the security report here in the Marina office, let me take a moment to ask you something important. If you're refinding value in this story about an engineer forced to polish boats while navigating asylum limbo and credential barriers, do Uncle Sam a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories about highly qualified immigrant professionals working survival jobs, while facing contempt from entitled people who have no idea about their expertise. Drop a comment telling me if you've witnessed similar situations, refugee professionals you've met, engineers or scientists doing manual labor because credentials aren't recognized, or times when someone's hidden expertise emerged during emergencies. These stories matter because they challenge assumptions about immigrants and remind US stat job titles tell you nothing about someone's actual capabilities. Paulo S. story has become a powerful advocacy tool precisely because it demonstrates so clearly do not protect public safety. They endanger it. An engineer can be cleaning boats and still be the most qualified person in the marina to prevent maritime disasters. Someone can have imperfect English and still possess technical expertise that exceeds native speakers. Professional competence and current job circumstances are often completely disconnected for immigrants navigating impossible licensing and immigration systems. The Silva case opened conversations that engineering organizations had been trying to start for years. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, an immigrant engineer advocate, had told me. Suddenly people were willing to listen to arguments about credential recognition and licensing barriers because Paulo had proven so dramatically that forcing qualified engineers into manual labor actively endangers public safety. Sometimes individual stories break through where policy arguments alone can't. But Dr. Rodriguez had also emphasized the limitations of relying on dramatic rescues for reform. For every Paulo who got his moment of vindication when Richard's yacht nearly exploded, there are hundreds of immigrant engineers whose expertise never gets recognized because they don't happen to be present during emergencies that validate their capabilities. They just quietly work survival jobs while their training goes to waste and their professional knowledge gradually becomes outdated. Those engineers matter too, even without dramatic disaster prevention stories to prove their worth. As I finished my security report and prepared to leave the marina, I reflected on how Paulo's journey from offshore platforms to boat cleaning to marine engineering captured something essential about refugee experience in America. The expertise had always been there. Paulo was the same engineer, whether he was designing billion-dollar oil platforms in Brazil or polishing yachts in Miami. What changed was whether systems and people could see past his job title and access to recognize that expertise and allow him to use it. The lesson stays with me. Professional credentials and current job circumstances are often completely disconnected for immigrants, especially refugees fleeing violence or corruption. The person cleaning boats might have designed offshore oil platforms. The dock worker might understand petroleum systems better than the yacht mechanics. And assumptions about people's capabilities based on their manual labor jobs and accents can literally cost lives when emergencies occur and only the stupid immigrant worker has the expertise to prevent disaster. So drop a comment and tell me what you think about credential recognition barriers and how we treat refugee professionals. Have you witnessed situations where highly educated immigrants were working manual labor? Have you met engineers or scientists whose expertise was being wasted because licensing systems wouldn't recognize their credentials? Share your city and country, and let's have real conversations about these issues that affect thousands of qualified professionals and ultimately endanger public safety when we prevent experts from practicing. Special thanks to Roberto Mendez from Miami Beach, Florida, and Angela Torres from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who've been engaging consistently with our videos. Roberto, your comment about your cousin who was a civil engineer in Venezuela, but works warehouse logistics here really resonated with viewers. Angela, appreciate you sharing how your father, who was a petroleum geologist in Colombia, ended up working retail management because his credentials were unrecognized. Keep those stories coming because they remind people that immigrants' current jobs often have zero connection to their actual professional expertise.
The lesson from Paulo S. story remains crystal clear. Expertise doesn't disappear because of job titles or accents. Professional competence can't be measured by current employment. And assumptions about intelligence based on manual labor work can be dangerously, even fatally wrong. Paulo Silva was an exceptional marine engineer, whether he was designing offshore platforms in Brazil or cleaning yachts in Miami. The only thing that changed was whether people could see past his dockworker uniform to recognize the engineering expertise that would eventually prevent a maritime disaster. Because at the end of the day, America has a choice. We can continue maintaining protectionist licensing barriers that keep refugee engineers cleaning boats while maritime disasters wait to happen. We can judge immigrants by their survival jobs rather than recognizing the expertise and integrity they bring despite impossible circumstances. We can mock professionals for their accents without knowing whether they understand complex systems better than we ever will. Or we can reform these systems to actually assess competence, recognize the sacrifices refugees made to maintain professional ethics, and utilize the tremendous engineering expertise that people like Paulo offer despite having lost everything to escape corruption. Paulo eventually got through after 5 years of fighting, 5 years during which his expertise was wasted. Maritime systems were less safe because qualified engineers weren't practicing. And America's engineering talent shortage worsened while a petroleum platform designer polished boats. That waste should outrage us into demanding reform rather than just celebrating that one individual persisted through an impossible system. Because for every Paulo Silva who makes it through eventually, there are hundreds who give up, who can't afford the years of manual labor while waiting for licensing approval, who age out of their technical knowledge during decade-long credentialing battles, or who simply accept that America will never recognize their expertise and stop trying. Those are the engineers who stay driving trucks, the geologists who keep working warehouses, the technical professionals whose expertise dies with them because protectionist systems valued limiting competition over serving public safety and honoring the sacrifices refugees made to maintain their professional integrity. All right, bro, it's time for this old man to finish the security report and head back to my hotel. But I hope Paulo's story stays with you the way it does with me, as a reminder that the people we dismiss based on their jobs and accents might be the only ones who can save us when disaster strikes. That refugees often bring more expertise and integrity than we'll ever develop ourselves. And that treating everyone with respect isn't just morally right, but pragmatically essential, because you never know when you might need the technical knowledge of the person you've been mocking. Thanks for staying with Uncle Sam through Paulo and Richard's story about that Miami marina, where one millionaire learned the hardest possible way that the dumb dock worker you mocked for months might be the only person who can prevent your yacht from exploding and killing dozens of people. Stay humble out there. Recognize that job titles tell you nothing about someone's actual expertise. And remember that assumptions about immigrants based on their survival work are almost always wrong and sometimes catastrophically dangerous. Until next time, bro.